How many of you have seen the movie The Princess Bride? Okay, most of you? Do you remember the albino in The Princess Bride? Who can tell me who the albino was? You remember who the albino was? I know you know, Molly. What was the albino in charge of? The pit of despair. Okay. Otherwise known as Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27. Okay. This is, I know I'm joking, but I've actually seen this passage referred to in scholarly articles as things like a dismal swamp and basically no man's land. So my goal tonight is not to straighten all that out, because I'm not about to straighten all that out. The whole point is that it can't be known with certainty. But this passage is a key element for prophetic views in general, but especially when people start talking about a tribulation period and a rapture and even things as esoteric as signs in the heavens and biblical chronology and Jubilee years and all sorts of weird stuff associated with prophecy. My goal tonight is to tell you, expose you to some things that you probably haven't been exposed to, because when you pick up a typical book on prophecy, again, like I said a couple weeks ago and last week, I guess, you pick up one of these books and everything looks beautiful. It all fits together. Just this wonderfully coherent, every question addressed sort of thing that is, and all of the views are subject to this, it's contrived in places. It works because it needs to work. Okay, everybody cheats. And this is one of the playgrounds for cheating. Okay, and what I mean by that is this is so complicated and so obtuse and so mind-bending and even mind-numbing that I hope that you go away thinking, man, this was so clear when I walked in, and now I don't know what to think. Okay, I'll have done my job then, because there's a lot of things you just are not told about the difficulties in this verse, and I'm going to give you a few of them. Not all of them. I'm going to give you a few of them. And hopefully you'll see how, again, as with the other 2 weeks, you'll see how your view works, and you'll see how other views work. Again, what decisions are made with respect to what questions, and at what points in the passage you have to stop, think about something, and then decide something. Everybody does it. The variety of views come from raising different questions at different points and giving different answers to them. So with that said, let's jump in here. Oh, come on, let's try it again. It popped off on me. There we go. You saw this diagram earlier, and this is your standard pre-mill, okay, return of Christ right here, prior to the millennium, so pre-mill, pre-trib, prior to the tribulation rapture. Pre-mill, pre-trib rapture. So we have two events. The person who holds this position is going to be a splitter. As we learned last week, are you a splitter or a joiner? You have one event associated with the second coming, or two. So here we have a splitter. We've got two events, rapture, second coming. Here's our millennial kingdom. Then we have the eternal state out here. And then there's this thing called the tribulation. And that's where we're going to park tonight, because what many familiar voices, familiar writers in prophecy talk about when they talk about the tribulation is they connect this thing called the tribulation to the 70th week of Daniel. And that's why this period is considered to be 7 years long. Now the term primarily comes from passages like Matthew 24, For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, moon will not give its light, stars fall from heaven, so on and so forth. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and all the tribes of earth will mourn. They'll see the Son of Man coming upon the clouds. So this is parsed as the second coming in this view, which is after this tribulation thing. You say, well, the 7 years, where does that come from? It comes from Daniel 9. And the passage is familiar. We have 70 weeks. Okay, a week is a period of 7 days. So a week in Scripture is often, but we'll find out tonight, not always, described as a period of 7. In this case, a period of 7 years. So 70 weeks are decreed about your people, your holy city. Again, the angels speaking to Daniel. To do these things, finish the transgression, put an end to sin, atone for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal the vision and the prophet, anoint a most holy place. Now we have here, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off. This word is Mashiach, which is the Hebrew word for Messiah, anointed one. It's not a very common word in the Old Testament. It can be used of a Jew or a Gentile. Okay, Isaiah 45:1 is the best example for a Gentile. Cyrus the Persian, who was a pagan, is called God's Mashiach because he's the one chosen to release the Jews and send them back home. Now let's think about some assumptions. We've got, again, back here, this 70-week thing. Looks like we've got something messianic going on. Of course, I'll come back and ask if that's the case or not. Let's start simply. We've got this 70th week thing. Is it the tribulation? The reasoning goes as follows. 70 weeks or 70 periods of 7 years. Almost everybody's going to agree on that. There's one exception I'll share with you tonight. So almost everybody's going to agree with that. And since these weeks are 7 years, it makes sense that the 70th week would also be 7 years. Right? Simple. It's fair. It's coherent. It's very understandable. But you'll notice in Daniel 9, you could go there to just keep tracking as I proceed. There's no reference here to a tribulation. So what happens is we go from these two obvious points to these. Well, if these are true, the Great Tribulation is 7 years long. That's just assumed. Therefore, the 70th week of Daniel is the Great Tribulation. Now, why is this assumed? Well, if we go back, it's assumed because we have this event here. We've got some messianic events. Messiah, 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 Messiah. And so the reasoning is, well, all the weeks that have come to this point had something to do with the Messiah, so the last one must too. So let's go back here. We have a series of 4 thoughts that go into this equation. Now the question is, does it work? Is there any evidence for it? Well, these two I think are fairly secure. These are the two that are the problem. If we run a search, and Dale, cover your eyes here. You'll know why if I can get my mouse here, you'll know why I'm saying that in a moment. This better work. Let's go back here. Come on. Okay. What do we got here? The highlights not show up on my desktop. So right here's our word tribulation, thlipsis. We're in Matthew 13. Okay. So I want you to see that that's the word. And if we, let's go back there. Let's just run a search on that one so I can show you something here. Okay, everywhere that this word occurs, I want you to see something. It's kind of interesting. Let's make it a little smaller. We can get more on here. Can you see the green highlighting here? Okay. If you go through, there's 45 hits. If you go through these, all the occurrences of this word, tribulation, and it's the same as in Matthew 24, right? Here's our Matthew 24 verse down here, several of them that we started with. You'll find that this word never occurs with the word 7, and it never occurs with the word week, ever. So, if you're going to make that equation, you have to say, I know that the words never match up. I know that there's no actual verse that equates the 70th week with the tribulation. But it makes sense for other reasons. Okay, that's how you have to argue. If you're on the other side, you say, that's all I need. There is no verse connecting them, that's where I'm stopping. So this is decision 1. Do I accept this equation? If you do, and again, the way you have to argue it is it makes sense on other grounds other than having a verse for it. If you do accept this, then it's going to take you in a certain direction in regard to interpreting the 70th week when you go back to Daniel. If you don't, that's going to take you in a different direction. Assumption 2. And this one's kind of mind-blowing. Is there one set of 70 weeks? You think, of course there's only one. I mean, what kind of a dumb question is that? I've never heard of anything else. Of course there's 70 weeks. Look at Daniel 9. It gives you 70 right in there. Yeah, it does. No, but watch. Here's what we usually do with Daniel 7. 70 weeks are decreed about your people, your holy city, so on and so forth. So there's our first reference to 70. Now we have 7 weeks down here, and then 62, and then 1. What we usually do is we go, okay, he gave us the 70 here, and now he's just breaking them up, and we add them up, and we see that that equals 70. So this and this are talking about the same thing. Sure, you can. That's completely possible to do that. This is the normal way of looking at it. If you look at it that way, then you make some other assumptions. You assume, and we'll come back to this one later, you assume that verse 24 here is talking about atonement in the sense of the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. As soon as you assume that, and you assume one set, then the issue comes to verse 25 where it says, from the going forth of the decree to rebuild the city, you have these weeks coming out. So then you have a choice. Where do I start the 70 weeks? Where do I start the 490-year countdown? The only one you can choose to make it end in 33 AD, which is a viable crucifixion date. It's not the only one, but it's probably the most popular. The only way you can make this equation, 490, it's about Jesus' work on the cross, and it ends at a date that works in chronology, is to choose number 3. This is where you have to start. Just by definition, you can't even think about these other options because you need it to work in conjunction with the crucifixion. Again, so what are the assumptions we've made? We're assuming we've got one set that's 490 years. We only have to think about 490 years. We're assuming that verse 24 is about Jesus' work on the cross. That means we have to start here to make it work here. And that's pretty much what you're going to see in most study Bibles, or at least in terms of a of a favorable pre-trib, pre-mill position. And other people who have other positions will represent this fairly. I don't want to say that they don't, but that's probably the most common way of looking at it. Now, number 3 here, Artaxerxes commissioned to Ezra. Remember, Ezra was a leader of one of the returns from captivity back to the Promised Land. If you actually read Ezra 7 to 11, verse 26, you can go there if you want. I'm not going to flip there. If you read that, there's nothing in the passage about rebuilding anything. Now, what that does is it forces you to look back at Daniel 9. And I know it has to be about Jesus. I know there's 490 years, and then there's this thing about from the going forth of the decree to rebuild the city. Rebuilding the city must not be literal. It must be referring to like rebuilding the people, to repopulating the land. That way, it doesn't matter if Ezra 7, 11 to 26 really says anything about building any structures. I'm off the hook. My view works. Now, if it's me, if I was over the shoulder of that person, I would say, that's a great cheat. Because I'm going to say that to everybody. Okay, everybody's going to have their way to cheat through the passage when they need to, because it never works in any view really tightly. You have to make certain little jumps of faith to make it work. What if there's 2 sets? 2 sets? How in the world would you do that? Okay, for my next trick, watch. 70 weeks are decreed. Got that down. It's easy. What if we separate verse 24 from the rest? We have 70 weeks here that result in this anointing the most holy place or whatever. And then we've got another sequence of 70. Whoa. Never thought of that. Very few people have, but there is one chronologist who takes this view. So I thought I would throw it in, because it's kind of interesting. If you take that view, here's what you come out with. The first 70 weeks are 70 years. Now catch that. The first 70 weeks are 70 years. That means a week is only 1 year. But the second set is 490. That means those weeks are 7 years. You say, well, that's kind of cheating. I mean, it's the same phrase. Why does it, why do I have to say the first set is 70, 1 week per year, and then the second set, I get to make that 7 a pop, so I get my 490. And here's what it looks like. You have the exile end right here. That's a biblical date that we can be relatively sure about. 70 years, we get the coming of Nehemiah. And then from Nehemiah's trip down here to AD 25, which is a possible crucifixion date, guess how many years that is? Well, it's 490. Wow, isn't that neat? Ta-da! See, well, that just looks like it's cheating. Yeah, I know. There's actually a way to argue it. Again, all of the views are trying to work from the text. Nobody's just like, hey, I don't like that one, let's have a game of marbles or checkers and come out with another view. No, they're all trying to do something with the text in front of them. Now, the first option here, this 70, the weeks are just 1 a pop, 1 year per week. There is chronological evidence, and I'll show you in a second, that 7 in this phrase, 70 weeks, could refer to every 7th year, 1 year out of 7, 1 year out of a week. If the person believes that the reference in Daniel is to a sabbatical cycle. A sabbatical cycle is something that's discussed in Leviticus 25. There's also evidence that the sabbatical cycle was multiplied by 7. Getting that out of the very next chapter in Leviticus, Leviticus 26, which we looked at the first week. That was the passage that talked about, that linked the Abrahamic covenant to the obedience of the Sinai covenant, and the whole question of do we have a kingdom or not. Is the Abrahamic covenant still in effect or not? Okay. Illustration. Leviticus 25 talks about sabbatical years. There are certain things in the Israelite religious calendar that were known as sabbatical years. They were every 7th year. 7-year cycle, every 7th year something special was called for. 7 sabbatical cycles, or 49 years, was called the Jubilee, the Great Jubilee cycle. The Jubilee was the maximum period of time where Israelite land could be retained by someone else other than its original owner. So in the Jubilee year, everybody got their land back. It went back to the original owner. And you had to release your slaves and stuff like this. This is out of Leviticus. In 2 Chronicles 36, which many would say Daniel 9 is tracking on, we read this. It's about the exile. All the vessels of the house of God, sent into Babylon, right there. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him. Talking about, Nebuchadnezzar, God's instrument here. They became servants to him and his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia. Persia was the one that got rid of the Babylonians. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths, all the days that it lay desolate, all the days that the land of Israel was unpopulated because of the exile, were 70 years. Now we know the exile was 70 years. They were in Babylon 70 years. But this passage, and it's alluding to something that Jeremiah said, citing the Jubilee cycle, or not the Jubilee cycle, but the sabbatical cycle. Apparently it connects the exile to the 70 years back to this whole Leviticus thing of every 7th year. From the chronicler's notion that the desolation made up the sabbatical rest of the land, it might be inferred that the reference was to 70 sabbatical years. This is from a famous commentary on Daniel. So the 70 weeks might be 70 and not 490. Now, if you believe in only one set, if you take this view, you're done with 70 years. If you take 2 views, then you can have the 70 and the 490. Or you can just decide to junk the whole sabbatical year thing and go with your traditional 490 up to the crucifixion, thinking that verse 24 is about Jesus. So you got lots of options here. This is why it's the pit of despair. Okay, because it's like, well, which one? And I'm only going to give you 3 or 4 things to think about in Daniel 9. It doesn't get much more complicated than this. I don't know if that's a relief or not. Okay. Now, go back here. The second option, what about the 490? Well, now we go to Leviticus 26. If you will not listen to me and do all these commandments, you're going to be in big trouble. Okay? You'll sow your seed in vain, your enemies will eat it. I will set my face against you. You shall be struck down before your enemies again. This is forecasting the exile. Those who hate you shall rule over you. You will flee when none pursues you. You're going to be skittish. And if in spite of this you will not listen to me, I will discipline you again 7-fold for your sins. So some people look at this verse and say, okay, Leviticus 26 is about the exile. And I know that 70 sabbatical year thing because in the prior chapter I read about that. But I think what God's saying here is I'm going to multiply it by 7. Now you got 490. Now the pre-mill, pre-tribbers love this passage, but they don't do much with Leviticus 25. And the reverse is true for the other positions. I like that one and not that one. Give me that one. You can, oh, don't worry about that one. And some will actually say, hey, I want them all. Okay, I want 2 sets of 70. So I don't offend anyone. Okay, the writer of Leviticus 25 and 26, okay, they're happy with me because I'm taking both. So that's why you would come out to this if you take both. It still ends in Jesus, but guess what? The 70 years are done with Jesus. There is no 70th week future tribulation out there that's connected with the rapture and the second coming. If you tie it into to Leviticus 26, you are done right here. There ain't no 7 more remaining. So again, I know this is quick, but I've given you like 3 or 4 options that all compete in what's published and what's preached. I mean, none of this is like Mike's making it up so he can fill airtime here. Okay, this is all out there. You're going to, depending on which study Bible you'd buy, you'd run into 1, 2, or maybe all of them. Assumption 3. Verse 24 is about Jesus' atoning sacrifice. Okay, give you a chance to rehearse verse 24 in your mind again. Look at the phrasing. Finish the transgression, put an end to sin, atone for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision and the prophet, anoint a most holy place. What do you think? Is that about the crucifixion? Well, assuming we have 490 years, let's go with that, and that it has something to do with the end, with the crucifixion, how does verse 24, if it speaks, how does it work if it speaks of Jesus' atoning death? Let's take them one by one. What is the scope of Jesus' atoning death? You tell me. What did it do? It's not a trick question. What did it do? For the sins of the elect, there's a brave soul right there. Were the elect saved? Oh, I could. Don't go there, don't go there. Pull yourself in here. Okay. I'm all right now. Who else? Come on, volunteer. Well, let's play with the elect a little bit. I won't go over it. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there. Were the elect Jews? Does it include Gentiles? All the elect Jew or Gentile? Okay. We can live with that for the sake of the illustration. Anybody else want to say it differently, or are we content with that? It's okay with me. "70 weeks are decreed about your people in your holy city." Oh, you better be careful here. Who's your people? Israel. What's your city? Jerusalem. Is there a disconnect there? Here's why you have to be careful. It's very obvious that we have Jews and Jerusalem right here. Gabriel's talking to Daniel. Who else would he be talking about? You know. If what's going on is about the death of Jesus, and we don't want to apply it just to Jews, and I don't see how we could. I mean, come on. We got this thing called the New Testament, and there's this thing called the church. Do you realize what that does, though? That makes an equation. That draws an equation. That's a strong word, equation. We could say it creates an analogy to make it weaker. Between the church and Israel. Oh, we were down that road in week 1, weren't we? Is the church distinct from Israel, or isn't it? If it's not, then the church inherits the promises given to Abraham, and you don't really need an earthly millennium. So do you want your church Israel equation here, but not with the Abrahamic covenant? I'm sorry, but you can't have both. Here's where I am the game show host, and I have to say, you got to pick door number 1 or door number 2. Okay, you don't get to pick door number 1 and 5 minutes later pick door number 2. You got to make a choice. Put an end to sin. Did Jesus put an end to sin? The pit of despair. That's what you'll go away with, the albino and the pit of despair. Did he make an end of sin? This is what Daniel 9:24 says. Did Jesus do that? Come on, somebody argue for it. I mean, I'll grant you, you can sort of make an argument. You got to play with words. Well, that's really bad to just play with the text. Yeah, well, everybody does it. Say it again.
Put an end to sin's power. In other words, it conquered the devil's power.
So you would prefer the word conquered sin? Okay, well, see, now you're adding a word. I'm trying to get you to not add one and still get your point. If we change this, put an end to, if we make it conquer, does that make anybody feel better? Okay. See, now you're adding a word too. You get the point, though. It depends how you define the terms. You really have to play with them. You got to massage them. Or if you're a scholar, you say things like, I'm just doing exegesis. You're doing semantic research. What you're doing is you're playing with the text, okay? That's what you're doing. You're doing what everybody else does, so just admit it. Well, if you think, it's about, ending transgression, putting an end to sin, that nobody ever sins anymore, well, the obvious answer is no. He doesn't put an end to sin. But if you define it a different way, conquering the problem of sin or something like that, well, then you can kind of get there, Well, I would say you couldn't be saved by hearing 100% of the Mosaic Law. I know. I know. I know where you're going. Here's another one. Another question. Did the death of Jesus atone for iniquity? Now, this is the one that lures everybody in. Well, sure. Of course it atoned for iniquity. So this phrase in Daniel 9:24, that's the one that makes us latch on to the crucifixion. We almost don't even see these and even ask about them. We're just drawn to that atone word. Yeah, I know what that's about. We get tunnel vision there. Did the death of Jesus do the rest of the stuff in Daniel 9? Did it bring in everlasting righteousness? Did it anoint a most holy place? Did it seal up the vision and the prophecy? Well, it just depends on what you mean. Yep, it sure does. Dax?
It's a question because I'm like you're following, and I think that there's a certain possibility that confession is specific but you're drawing a line saying we have to have the 490 years end with the death of Jesus, which is not the sort of standard pre-revolution.
You'd have to have the 483 end with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I know the slide you just showed, which is why I'm asking the question.
Mm-hmm.
You showed that a sort of a pre-mill approach would start with Artaxerxes, Ezra, I think it was in 532.
That's the easiest fit.
Right. And
Some would say it's the only fit, depending on how,
and that's ending then with Ezekiel 69,
Mhm.
33. But then you're taking the next position, which was 2,
Mhm.
you're leapfrogging to Nehemiah, and then starting from Nehemiah and going to 490. But that's
Mhm.
that's later in the game.
It's later. It's later in the game, depending on where you start and how you define the weeks.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, to me, what maybe didn't come out,
Mhm.
was that you define the weeks differently. Like,
Mhm.
you did a prophetical years, or something, your second interpreter guy didn't handle the time like people who handle it.
Right, because what you're saying is going to factor into the next assumption, the princes. Because that's going to decide whether you take the 70 or you cut them up.
So stop at your 69 weeks, you got your 7, then you,
Mhm.
sorry, 7 and 62, and then
Mhm.
the 7.
Right.
The end, which is,
That's what Dax is saying. It depends on if you view them as a unit or if you view a separation between the 69th and the 70th. And that in turn depends on what you do with the prince that's coming up. So hang on, we'll get there. Here's another view. And this one will take the 70 as complete. 70 weeks are determined for your holy city, okay, all your people. To finish the transgression, put an end to sin. Atone for iniquity, and do all this other stuff. Some would say that it was about the end of the exile. So let's plug that in. 70 weeks, and that assumes that it's 70 years. Remember the Leviticus 25 thing. Were decreed about your people and your holy city. Okay? To finish the transgression. Okay, what transgression? Well, the reason they got sent into exile. Right? They're done now. Put an end to that sin, that particular one. You're forgiven now. Atone for iniquity. It's another way of saying transgressions forgiven. Bring in everlasting righteousness. Now this one, you have to assume that the Jew thought, okay, here's the assumption for the non-pre-trib, pre-mill view. You have to assume that the Jew thought, when we go back, we are reestablishing the kingdom of God on earth. Because we're the chosen people. We're going to go back to the land that God gave us, the covenant. God is remembering the covenant. God is going to be there with us. The kingdom of God is going to be there on earth. And since we're forgiven and the Lord is back with us, He's not going to leave again. It's going to be everlasting. And you have to think in these terms to make this view work. Seal both vision and the prophet. Well, whose vision, which prophet? It depends. Is he talking about Daniel? Is the angel Gabriel talking about Jeremiah, who prophesied the 70-year captivity? Seal it up. It's done now. Okay. Vision's all over with. Is he talking about that? Maybe he's talking about the passage in Chronicles. I mean, who knows? But that's how you have to think about it. Anoint a most holy place. Oh, we get the temple back. This is an easier fit, but it still has as many guesses. You're guessing that this is sort of the consciousness that the thing that would be in the head of the writer, and of course would correspond to the reality. You know, you can make that work nicely, but you have to assume that's how to parse the words. That's how to go through the passage. That's the filter you create to go through the passage in your head. Now, here's our fourth one. The prince issue. The anointed one of verse 26a is not the prince of 26b. Same verse. You assume that these characters are distinct and different as opposed to talking about the same guy. So you got to make a choice here. Notice in this verse, okay, know therefore and understand the going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince. Notice that anointed one and prince are juxtaposed. They're appositional. The anointed one is the prince. It's the same guy when they occur right next to each other. It's a way of redefining the prior term. That one is fairly straightforward. he's associated with the first 7 weeks. So this one, we can pretty much dispense with because we want to know if the end of the 70 weeks are future, where that happens. The first 7, who cares, okay? The issue is right here, verse 26. After the 62, now we have 7 and 62, so after the 69th week is done. After the 62, an anointed one shall be cut off. Anointed one is Mashiach, same as back here. And this is assumed to be the crucifixion by many views. This would be at the end of the 69th week. The other views are going to be at the end of the total 70. But we have here an anointed one gets cut off. And many people assume that refers to put to death, or crucifixion. So people look at this and they see the Messiah in this verse because of this phrase. Now, here's the trick. That's 26a. The people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So the assumption is this guy can't be this guy. Even though both terms, anointed and prince, were fused back here, here we separate them into 2 guys. So that's one view, one assumption. Even though they're joined here, I need to split them here so that one of them is crucified and the other one is some future, the Antichrist, okay, is how this is usually applied. Well, again, you can create a scenario where that works and needs to work and flows nicely. What if they're not different? Okay? Again, this is what the second prince does. Again, this is why we associate him with the Antichrist, the abomination down here. What if it's the same guy? If it's the same guy, then this can't be the Messiah, because obviously Jesus didn't walk in there and destroy the city and the temple and all that stuff. So if you think, I feel compelled, now catch my wording here, because this is where some people are at. I feel compelled to treat them as the same because the terms are fused back here. I have no right to split them here. And so I'm going to make it all the same, and therefore Daniel 9 cannot be talking about the crucifixion. And if you make that choice, it's going to take you in a completely different direction than if you see Jesus here in terms of the timing with the weeks. Okay, one view, you have a crucifixion event at the 483, and then you have 7 years yet future. Okay, in the pre-trib, pre-mill view, that would be the future tribulation. The other view doesn't have anything like that because Jesus is not even in the passage at all. It's a bad guy. It's a real nasty dude. It's not the Messiah. You say, well, how can you get an evil guy called, anointed? Well, because you got people like Cyrus, who was a pagan. He's not a believer. The guy's a pagan king, pagan emperor. He's anointed because he's God's instrument. That's all it means. I've chosen you to do a task. You're anointed to do that task. Now get off your butt and do it. Okay? That's what it means. And you can have a bad guy do that because you've had a bad guy before. In fact, Isaiah, some would try to unite those two to this. I don't think you can really get away with that. But there's at least a precedent here for a pagan person being called anointed. God's chosen to do whatever it is God wants him to do. Now, those are our 4 assumptions. Yes, Dax.
Where do people end up with it if you go that way? You can't get to
You're going to press it all into Antiochus. And you're going to say Antiochus is a type of probably Titus. Again, if you're going to press it all into Antiochus, the propensity is that you're going to be a preterist anyway when you get to Revelation. Do you all know what I mean by a type, by the way? Some of you. Okay. Let me explain it this way. When we talk about prophecy, we usually think of things that are written out or uttered, a prophetic utterance. Thus says the Lord, blah, 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 blah. And then that stuff that's said is a prophecy. That's easy. A type is a non-verbal prediction. A type is an event, a person, an institution that prefigures something that will come down the road. Best example is the Passover lamb. Passover lamb's not laying there uttering prophecy. He's just laying there dead. Okay? The Passover lamb, though, is a prefigured. It's a foretelling. It's a pattern. It's a prefigurement of something that's going to happen in the future. And what is that? It's Jesus on the cross. Paul says Christ is our Passover lamb. Okay, so sometimes in the Old Testament, you actually have a fair number of them. You have a person, event, or an institution whose life or circumstances forecasts something greater. And so many people will take the Daniel 9 thing and say, all of the events of Daniel 9 are fulfilled in Daniel 11. Because Daniel 11 is a description of things that happen in the mid-100s BC. Remember Daniel had those 4 kingdoms, okay, Babylon, the Medo-Persian, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. Well, if you actually track that through the rest of the book, when you get to the 3rd kingdom, the Greco-Roman period, that's in the mid-100s BC. It's not in biblical history, it's in the intertestamental period. There was a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the ruler of 1/4 of Alexander the Great's empire. He lived up in Syria in the north. He came down and, cutting to the chase, desecrated the temple, slew a pig on the altar, made it a death penalty offense to circumcise and to observe the Passover and all this kind of stuff. He was viewed as the great cosmic enemy that Daniel was talking about, the one who commits the abomination. If you're going to take that view, and practically everybody thinks Antiochus is important, you're going to say all of Daniel 9 is fulfilled with Antiochus, but what he does is a prefiguring, it's a type of something that's going to yet happen. Because when Jesus is here, in Matthew 24, he says, you've heard it spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Okay, and he talks about the abomination. Now, Jesus knows what happened 150 years prior to him being there. He knows about Antiochus. But he still says that's still future. And so what many preterists do is they'll say what Antiochus did to fulfill Daniel 9 was sort of a warm-up or a prefiguring of what Titus will do in 70, destroying the temple, this time for good, destroying the city. So that's how you would stay in the passage, but not be, future tribulation. Go ahead. It depends where. It would depend on your starting point and the amount of literalness you attribute to the numbers to make it work. Other questions? I wonder if that's going to work for me here. I'm getting a red circle. That's not good. All right. Okay, we already talked about there's no verse that makes the equation, but again, maybe the equation deserves to be made on the basis of other things, so it's an open question. Other questions would be, why is there no mention of 7 years in the book of Revelation? You say, well, that's kind of odd. If you actually search for the number 7, you won't find it associated with years in the book of Revelation. You will find 3.5 years. Well, that's half of 7, so 7's floating around there somewhere. Again, maybe you can make the argument on another basis, but you don't actually have a reference to 7 years. Okay? Why is there no mention of weeks in Revelation? Well, you don't need them. It's just 7 years. We don't have 7, but we got the 3.5 a couple times, so it's good enough for me. Maybe it is. Who knows? Why is Daniel 9:24-27 not quoted in the book of Revelation? That one's kind of odd. Who cares if the events are described? You don't need the verse quoted. If lots of things are described that, sort of go with Daniel 9, it's good enough. Maybe it is. Again, you just have to come down somewhere. Now, on the other side, we just sort of warmed up to this. The 70th week, if you're a preterist means you believe that most and perhaps all prophecy has already been fulfilled. The only ambiguity is really the second coming. So you believe all the events of Daniel 9 have been fulfilled. And a lot of preterists are amillers. So I've lumped them together for the sake of the slide. 70th week expires around the crucifixion. So they're going to take that view. Or maybe around the time of Paul's conversion, give or take. It's not too many years different. So most preterists are going to take this view. 70th week's over with the crucifixion of Jesus. Some say 70th week refers to this period here, 66 to 73. It's when Rome takes over and destroys a lot of Jews in the temple, because halfway you get the temple destroyed, 70 AD. And isn't that kind of coincidental? 66 to 73. 3.5 years in, you get the temple destroyed, and 3.5 years later it's all over. Okay, so some of them are going to go there. The key verse for any of these views is 9:26, because there's a reference to the destruction of the city and the sanctuary. And everybody knows that happened in 70, and so they'll say that's when the passage was finally fulfilled. It could have been fulfilled with Antiochus. Antiochus is kind of a warm-up. He didn't destroy the whole city, but he destroyed a lot of things, and So they'll either say Antiochus was a warm-up, a type to Titus, or they'll put off the 70th week to right here and then get the destruction of the sanctuary there. Either way. This depends on really one thing. Well, not only one thing, but really, really, really vital. When the book of Revelation was written. And the key passage is Revelation 11:2. If you want to flip there, you could. I'll show it to you, but you might want to have it in front of you. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. 3.5 years. Here's a reference to the temple, right there. Now, here are the two views. Some believe that the book of Revelation was written prior to 70 AD, and everything in the book of Revelation, except maybe the second coming, is already fulfilled. Okay? They think that the events of the book of Revelation are a way of describing the destruction of 70 AD. And to do that, it helps if it's written before. And here are the arguments that are used. Whoever's writing this would have been crazy to mention the temple if there was no temple. Why would they do that? Because somebody living after 70 AD would read that and go, what is that? We don't even have a temple. What's that? Must be an error. It assumes the reference is literal, that the temple here is like the structure. They also would argue on the basis of 666. And some manuscripts read 616. They don't all read 666 for the number of the beast. But both numbers are ciphers for the name of Nero. You can make both numbers work with Nero's name, because Nero had a couple names, and it depends how you spell them and how long they are. Use the abbreviated form or not. Again, you're cheating the whole way. All right. So Nero lived before 70. So the book had to be written before 70. They'll also argue that Babylon, and the great whore, represents apostate Jerusalem, not Rome. So that the pictures of Babylon's destruction throughout the book portray the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, that's one view. The other view that you're probably more familiar with, because this is the one that is held by, I think it's fair to say, all futurists when it comes to looking at things like a rapture and a tribulation. They're all going to interpret the book of Revelation as forecasting a distant future, or perhaps an imminent future set of prophecies. That view has the book written in the 90s. Here's the evidence. After 70 AD, Babylon used by Jewish writers for Rome exclusively. In other words, in all the other ancient literature out there, outside of the New Testament, Babylon is used by Jewish writers, and the writer of Revelation would have been Jewish, only for Rome. So it's completely opposed to this point here. You will not find a Jewish writer using the term of Jerusalem. You find it a lot used of Rome. And the reason they do that is because as Babylon destroyed the temple and Jerusalem, so did the Romans. Back in 70 AD, because the author's writing in the 90s. He sees a clear analogy there. So for him, Babylon is Rome. It's the Roman Empire. It's not the Catholic Church, by the way. There was no Catholic Church in the 90s AD. It didn't exist. The Roman Empire existed, but the Catholic Church did not. There's no instance before or after 70 AD for Babylon being symbolic for Jerusalem, just more generally. You know, this point's really lacking on the other side. And probably the one piece of evidence that is most used is this one. The church fathers Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Eusebius all say it was written in the 90s. Irenaeus discusses 666 and the beast. He goes through a number of interpretations as to what this beast thing means with the 666. He doesn't even consider Nero as an option. In fact, he rejects any equation with any Roman emperor. If you're living in the 90s, that would make sense. You'd have to go and look historically as to why that is, because the Roman Empire was in turmoil. You pretty much had Roman emperors like we had Soviet premiers back in the 80s. You know, they last about 2 weeks and they're gone, you know, that kind of thing. They just kept dying like flies. So there's no powerful emperor until you get around 100 or so. Then you have some serious power with Rome. But up until this point, if you're in the 90s, it's like, you got to be kidding. One of these guys was the beast? I mean, good grief. You know, he was weak. He didn't last long. So Irenaeus doesn't even have any time for it at all. That's your trip to the pit of despair. This is probably the most complicated it gets. But I think you can see this is really important to any view of prophecy. Where in the world am I going to land? And it's not that you have to pick, it's not that you have to make 4 or 5 separate decisions. What you may have caught, and what I didn't really stress, was as soon as you make one, it kind of forces you to make this one over here. And if you put those two together, well, then I got to take this one back in numbers. You're sort of trapped. There's only a finite number of ways that all of the decisions work together. So you have to, it's kind of a dicey proposition as to where you're going to land, because everybody wants to be consistent in what they're doing, the way they approach Daniel 9, all these other passages. And that's tricky. Even getting past the fact that I'm making these decisions because I think it's the best guess. It's a reasonable guess. It looks, I feel like I can defend that guess pretty well And that's okay. Everybody has to defend their guess. What I don't want you to go away with is thinking that your guess is somehow more biblical than somebody else's guess. Or you have some sort of inside track that makes your guess better. Everybody's guessing. They're just trying to do the best they can. So that's why we got into last year with the elders. This is no hill to die on. None of these are hills to die on. You just need to be charitable. I don't know where anybody's at here, except maybe my wife. But she doesn't know. So, any questions? Any pleas for mercy? Any pleas for help? Okay. No questions, you are free to go. Thanks for coming.